Hey, folks. Now, I personally find history of all forms incredibly fascinating while enlightening. And clearly, boxing, African American history, and so many other forms of history rank high on my preferred reading genre list. Now, many have written how, without knowledge of history, history is doomed to repeat itself. But she also serves a second purpose in that we can also reflect and see how far we have come as a society since yesteryear. Now, when all three of these topics are amalgamated together, it makes for a riveted pupil in eye. And when it comes to the Black Murderers Row, dun 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 dun. Ah! 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 My name is Bola Ray, and this is the scoop. Now, Jack Johnson was one of the first black men permitted to fight a white man, let alone permitted to fight for a world title. Now, once that happened, history was never the same again, in that some were permitted to actually compete against white men and actually compete for world titles. There's quite a few of them. But then there were the unfortunate ones who still couldn't rise to success within this realm. In the 1930s and 40s, there was a fraternity, if you will, of 8 black fighters that were so good, and yet never once stepped in the ring for a world title shot as a competitor. These men were known as the Black Murderers Row. They were seen as boxing's underclass that were constantly ranked within the top 10 of the divisions, either welterweight, middleweight, sometimes light heavyweight, and yet never permitted to go to the dance. The name had nothing to do with them ever unlawfully taking a life, and that even most of them never even had a criminal record. They were just dangerous black boxers who most didn't want anything to do with them to protect their successes. I'm guessing that for whatever reason, they didn't sell their souls to the mob, hence why the powers that be didn't permit them the opportunity to actually go for it and succeed. But again, this is my hypothesis. So this week, I'm going to showcase an elite fraternity, or members from this elite fraternity, who actually put the fear of God into the greatest, Sugar Ray Robinson. Sugar Ray Robinson, full-blown, avoided them. And the fight that he did have with one of them, the guy was actually paid to take a dive. They were that good and that unfortunate, all in the same breath. Aaron Little Tiger Wade was born March 17th, 1916 in Trenton, Tennessee. And he was also the first African-American Golden Glove champion of Peoria, Illinois. Now, the actual number of amateur fights is unclear, but going by consensus, he had no less than 600 amateur fights and maybe as much as 750, of which he won almost all of them. Let that sink in for a bit. Yeah. The scenario was simple for members in the Black Murderers Row in that they could have non-title fights against virtually anybody, or fight each other, which was incredibly action-packed and talented. But when it came to the actual world title fights, they were shunned. The powers that be protected the celebrities, if you will. Aaron Wade's fights with other members of the Black Murderers Row he had 3 losses to Charlie Burley. He had 1 win over Hubert Lewis Coca Kid Hardwick. He had 2 losses and a draw to Jack Chase. You would have heard of some of these fighters in my previous podcasts, having gone up against the likes of Archie Moore, Floyd Patterson, people of that era. He actually had a loss to Sugar Ray Robinson. And in that loss, he had already retired, was in retirement for 2 years when they called him out of retirement to take the fight against Sugar Ray Robinson. Sugar Ray Robinson refused to fight them 5 years prior when the collection of them was doing a tour through California, and they continuously called for the champ to come down. Actually, the champ had said, handlers had said, he's coming down to do a tour. Found out that the guys were there, backed out himself. Aaron Wade finished his career with a record of 64 fights with 16 wins. 64 wins with 16 losses and 6 draws. 32 KOs. Wade, post his fight, like I said, 2 years after he had originally retired, came out of retirement to fight Robinson. Then he became Robinson's sparring partner. And this is quite the story in that we're going back to 1948. And according to the Boston Post, a defunct newspaper, had an article about Wade being Robinson's sparring partner. And one day they got into an argument because Wade was to be paid a certain amount for his sparring sessions, but then Robinson decides that he's going to shortchange him, citing that the turnout at his last fight wasn't as much as he had anticipated, which was nothing, where he's making $20,000 on average, $25,000 a fight, and he's paying these guys for sparring for less than $50. But $50 was everything to these guys. That was a substantial living in the late 40s, right? And he starts shortchanging them. Shortchanging Aaron. Aaron got upset. Aaron left the gym. Aaron went for a walk to a local establishment, had some pints, came back, waited for Ray. Ray eventually took his sweet time after training, cleaning up, making himself all dolled up. Was the last person to leave the gym. Locked the door. And who meets him but Aaron Wade, with nothing shy of alcohol on his breath. Now, you have to understand something. Aaron Wade was a monstrous, absolutely monstrous 5'5", and started his career at 140, but then gradually moved up in weight to welter, middle, even light heavyweight. He fought and he was dominant at 5'5". Yeah, just wrap your head around that. He walks up to him and says, you made the deal to pay me a certain amount. I need to get this money. He goes, Ray, me paraphrasing, pretty much said, you ain't getting it. And then Ray got it. Apparently, Aaron put quite the beating on Robinson in that, yeah, Ray was left with 5 to 6 separated ribs and what was described as the size of a pullet's egg welt just over his heart. Now, complete transparency, I didn't know what a pullet's eggs was, but apparently it's just a young chicken and they have smaller eggs. Sure. Yeah. So he took an ass bus from a man. And yet, all my life, I've always heard about Ray Robinson being the greatest, untouchable. The fights that he had, devastating. But there was a class above that was suppressed by the day. Ray's beating was so bad that he had to take 2 months off of training. Now, 2 months doesn't really sound like a whole lot, but you have to understand, in those days, Ray would fight as many as 3, maybe even 4 times a month. That's just the day. Like, they just fought all the time. So think of it from the standpoint that this was a significant dent in his pocketbook, but more so also the promoters that pushed Ray. He was their ticket, and he wasn't fighting for 2 months. All over $50. He just paid him $50, right? So, apparently there was uncovered evidence that Wade took a dive in their fight. According to Wade's son, Robinson was unaware of the fix, and it was all the promoter being the culprit. He had paid Wade a few $100 to take the dive, and according to Savannah Evening Press, a newspaper in the day, Wade was described as beginning to hit the canvas for no apparent reason. In quotes. Yeah. He needed the money. A couple $100 is thousands of dollars in conversion today. So, like tens of thousands, actually. So, the overwhelming side of being in Murderer's Row was that it was apparent that they didn't earn the money and were not rewarded for their skill set at all. For guys who were as talented as they were, society did not repay them for their achievements or their gift, which was nothing shy of sad. Now, life after boxing was one of hills and valleys for Wade. Post-boxing, Wade descended into alcoholism, but thankfully he pulled himself out and became an ordained minister, Christian minister, and dedicated the remainder of his life to working with the downtrodden and unfortunate, I guess, of an area in San Francisco called the Fillmore District. Wade passed away of a heart attack February 15th, 1985. He was 68 years young. No. It's stories like this that is hard for me to hear about, but the unfortunate reality is that they're still prevalent today. In a slightly different form, but very much still prevalent. The practice of putting a fighter on the shelf is still very much alive and well today. Now, this is a scenario where a promoter may have invested a great deal in a certain fighter, brought him up either to the point of fighting for a world title or is now a world champion. But the promoter, it cost him a lot to get there, and he hasn't recouped his investment yet. So and there's a new up and coming young buck who clearly can take out his fighter. So what some promoters do is they get that fighter under contract, and now they're promoting that fighter. And instead, what logic would dictate is, like, have him fight, you still have the other fighter making you money. But on the contrary, what they do is they put him on the shelf, which means that they either get him lackluster fights or whatnot, or they just don't keep him active at all and wait out his career, his contract until their golden boy can either fall from grace or make a whack ton of money. They can give them nothing fights or an activity. One would wonder, what would they get out of that scenario? And it really is nothing. Nothing. The sport has changed, and that's all I can take a great deal of solace in, because yesteryear was not a pretty place, especially for a lot of blacks. Now, that's my show. If you like this show and like this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe. Don't forget the notification bell. It's your boy Bola. That's a scoop. Cheers, folks.